In a longhouse somewhere in the Old Norse world, a woman speaks. The fire at the center of the room has been burning for hours. Its light moves across the carved wooden posts that hold the roof, catching the shapes of animals and spirals cut into the grain, throwing them briefly into relief and then releasing them back into shadow. The woman is seated, not standing. She does not gesture or raise her voice. She speaks the way water moves, not hurrying, not pausing without reason, each word placed with the particular care of someone who knows exactly what weight it carries. Around her, the hall is quiet. The people gathered to hear her are quiet in the specific way of those who understand that what is being said is not being said for the first time and will not need to be said again. Her name, or the title by which she would have been known, was Volva. It meant something close to staff bearer, from the long ceremonial staff she carried as a mark of her calling, though the word carried far more than the object it named. In the Norse tradition, the Volva was an itinerant practitioner of scythe Yura form of working that moved along the border between the present and what was fated to come. She traveled between communities, summoned when she was needed, paid in food and hospitality, and sometimes silver for the services she performed. What she offered was not comfort exactly. It was knowledge of the shape of things, the weather ahead, the fate of a child newly born, the outcome of a matter whose resolution was not yet visible. The tradition held that this knowledge existed somewhere beyond ordinary perception, and that the Volva, through the long deliberate method of her practice, could reach it. On the night the Velaspa imagines, the night whose telling became the most celebrated poem in the Norse poetic tradition, the one who had summoned her was not a farmer worried about the harvest, or a jarl uncertain about a coming campaign. He was Odin, and what he wanted to know was the fate of everything. The Velaspa is the first poem of the Poetic Edda, and, across all the textual sources available to scholars of Norse mythology, the single most important record of the myth of Ragnarok. Its name means the prophecy of the seeress, and its structure is precisely what the name describes. A monologue delivered by a Velva, who has been summoned from the dead by Odin, who addresses her lord quietly and without deference across its roughly 66 stanzas, telling him what the world was before it was made, what it has been since, and what it will become when the long process of its unmaking is complete. She does not appear to be alarmed by what she knows. She appears, if anything, to hold her knowledge the way an old craftsperson holds a finished object, with the particular calm of someone who has worked very carefully and understands what the result amounts to. To hold that poem is to hold something that has traveled a very long way. The text that preserves the Voluspa, along with the other poems of the Poetic Edda, is the Codex Regius, a compact Icelandic manuscript written on calfskin pages, its dimensions modest, its ink still dark after centuries of careful storage in conditions that were not always ideal for preservation. The manuscript is dated to approximately 1270 CE, though the poems it contains are understood to be considerably older than their written form, carrying the marks of an oral tradition that long preceded the Christian era in which the compilation was made. The Codex Regius was rediscovered in 1643 when a bishop named Brynjolfur Sveinsson came into possession of it, a moment whose quiet significance only becomes fully apparent when one considers that the manuscript had been effectively invisible to the scholarly world for several centuries, sitting in private hands in Iceland, while the traditions it preserved were discussed mainly through secondary sources and incomplete citations. Bishop Brynjolfur sent the manuscript to the King of Denmark, as was the custom with objects of significant cultural value in those years of Danish sovereignty over Iceland. He accompanied this gift with a misattribution. He believed, or at least proposed, that the Poetic Edda was the work of the 12th century Icelandic historian Samandri the Learned, an attribution that the scholarly consensus has since firmly set aside. Since the poems almost certainly predate Samandri's lifetime by generations and bear none of the marks of his known method of composition, but the misattribution held for long enough to give the collection one of its enduring alternative names, the Elder Edda, and the manuscript itself eventually arrived in Copenhagen, where it remained until 1971, when it was returned to Iceland as a cultural treasure. A journey of more than 3 centuries, from a bishop's hand in Skalholt to a vault in Reykjavik, full of it traveled by those small dark calfskin pages whose contents had been waiting with considerable patience for the world to know they existed again. That the Codex Regius survived at all is from one angle a matter of contingency. Manuscripts of this age and type were not always treated as irreplaceable records of cosmological tradition. They were sometimes recycled for the materials they were made from, or lost in fires, or simply stored badly in the damp basements of farmhouses where the concept of archival humidity control had not yet arrived. The Völuspá's survival, in the form we have it, represents a particular concatenation of luck and care, the decision to write it down at all, the decision to keep what had been written, and the decision, more than once across the centuries, not to discard what might have seemed like a strange relic of a superseded way of understanding the world. The other major source for the myth of Ragnarok is different in character from the Poetic Edda, different in intention, and arrived at by a different route. Around 1220 CE, an Icelandic scholar and historian named Snorri Sturluson composed a handbook for poets. This was the Prose Edda, and its purpose was pragmatic rather than devotional. By Snorri's time, the Old Norse mythological tradition had been displaced by Christianity for roughly 2 centuries, and the intricate system of kennings, the compressed, elusive figurative phrases that gave traditional skaldic verse its particular density and texture, was becoming opaque to younger poets who had not grown up in the world. Those kennings described, a kenning like the Sea of Blood of Ymir, used by skalds to mean simply the ocean, presupposes an audience that knows who Ymir is and what happened to his body at the creation of the world. Without that background, the phrase is not evocative, it is simply obscure. Snorri's solution was to write the mythology down, in prose, with the practical understanding that a poet who wanted to use the old imagery correctly needed to know the old stories thoroughly. His section Gylfaginning, The Beguiling of Gylfi, contains the most sequential and complete prose account of Ragnarok available to modern scholars. Structured as a dialogue in which the Swedish king Gylfi travels to Asgard in disguise and asks the gods about everything from the creation of the world to its eventual end. The gods answer him at length and with considerable detail until he has what he came for. Snorri was not, as far as the evidence suggests, a believer in the religion whose mythology he was recording. He was a scholar and a man of considerable political ambition who happened also to be a genuinely careful literary historian, and he pressed the old oral tradition into prose with the attention of someone who found it interesting rather than the reverence of someone who found it holy. This distinction matters because Snorri's account of Ragnarok is not simply a transcription of what the Völuspá contains. It is an interpretation, an arrangement, and in places an expansion, a thoughtful 12th century scholar's effort to produce a coherent, sequential narrative from material that was not originally designed to be coherent or sequential in his sense of those words. The Völuspá's 66 stanzas are dense with illusion and compressed with the particular economy of oral verse, where each line is a mnemonic cue for a larger body of knowledge that audiences of the Viking Age would have carried in memory, the way a single note, heard at the right moment, can call back a whole song. Snorri unpacked the compression and arranged it into a story that could be read in order from beginning to end. What this gained in accessibility, it may have lost in some of the original texture, the oblique angles, the gaps that were not failures of transmission, but spaces where the tradition expected its audience to fill in what it already knew. The image of the Voluspa's stanzas compressed onto their manuscript pages carries something of this quality. Each stanza is short, 4 to 8 lines, usually its language dense and its imagery multiple. The stanza that describes Fimbulwinter, the great triple winter before the ending of all things, contains in its few lines the material that a Viking Age audience would have recognized as an entire body of tradition about the moral and environmental collapse that precedes Ragnarok. Where a modern reader might need a paragraph, the seeress needed 4 lines, because the 4 lines were meant to land in a mind that was already prepared to receive them. The manuscript preserves the lines. It cannot fully preserve the mind they were written for, and this gap between the text as physical object and the oral tradition that gave the text its full meaning is one of the things that makes the study of Norse mythology particularly alive as an ongoing conversation rather than a settled archive. Snorri had access to versions of the oral tradition that were still relatively intact in 13th century Iceland, and his obvious familiarity with the material suggests he drew on sources, both written and recited, that are no longer available to modern scholars. The Gylfaginning account of Ragnarok draws on the Voluspa extensively, but also on other poems, now partially or wholly lost, and on a living tradition of skaldic composition in which the mythological figures were still being used as reference points, still being invoked in verses addressed to contemporary patrons, still functioning as the shared background of a poetic culture that had not entirely abandoned the old framework even in a Christian age. What Snorri built from this material is something that works both as mythological record and as literary text, careful enough to be trusted as a source, shaped enough to be read as a narrative. At the center of both the Voluspa and the Gylfaginning account, the figure most present is not any of the combatants of the final battle, not Freyr or Thor or the great wolf whose name will come later. It is Odin, the All-Father, as the tradition sometimes calls him, though even that title is a simplification of what the oldest layers of the Norse sources describe: a god of wind and death and transformative knowledge, a figure whose origins seem to go back considerably farther than his role in the settled pantheon of the later Viking Age, back to something older and more difficult to characterize, something associated with the long roads and the cold open spaces and the particular knowledge that comes from being willing to stand at the edge of what is comfortable and look past it. The tradition holds that Odin sacrificed one eye at the well of Mimir, the deep well at the root of Yggdrasil that holds the wisdom of all ages in its water. He gave the eye as payment for a single drink, and the eye went down into the well and stayed there, preserved in its dark water, and Odin went away, seeing differently than he had before, not less by any obvious measure, but through a different arrangement of the visible and the invisible. What he gained from the drink is described as wisdom, though the Norse tradition's sense of wisdom in this context is closer to what might be called prophetic knowledge, the ability to see the shape of what is fated, not simply the facts of what is present. The eye was not given for information. It was given for the particular capacity to understand how things connect to their outcomes, how the present moment carries within it the long thread of what it will eventually become. This same drive carries the story of the Havamal, the words of the High One, a gnomic poem of the Poetic Edda, where Odin describes hanging himself from the branches of Yggdrasil, the immense ash tree that connects and sustains the 9 worlds of Norse cosmology, for 9 nights. He hung with a spear wound, and without food or water, alone on the tree, with no one to give him aid, in his own words. He hung still and cold in the dark for 9 nights, not in agony of the kind that calls for attention, but in the specific endurance of someone waiting for something that requires stillness to arrive. On the 9th night, the runes revealed themselves to him below. He gathered them up with a cry, and the 9 nights of hanging ended. The image of Odin on Yggdrasil is not one of motion. It is worth sitting with its stillness for a moment. He is not climbing the tree, not exploring it, not engaged in any visible activity at all. He is simply hanging, held by the tree that holds all the worlds, for a duration that the tradition measures in the same units it uses to measure the great ceremonial periods and the sacred thresholds of the cosmos. 9 is not an arbitrary number in Norse thinking. It is the number of the worlds, the number of steps Thor will take after killing the Midgard serpent, the number of nights that keeps appearing at the significant transitions of the tradition. Odin hung for 9 nights because 9 was the number of a completed thing, and what he was waiting for required completion, the full passage through the threshold of ordinary knowing into the knowledge that exists on the other side of it. The runes he gathered were not letters, exactly, though they were later used as a writing system. In the Norse tradition, the runes were understood as the fundamental units of meaning underlying the structure of the world, the shapes that things took when their nature was made visible, the language in which fate was written into the fabric of existence. To know the runes was to have some capacity to read and to work with the deep structure of what was. This is the knowledge Odin bought with 9 nights of stillness, and whatever suffering belonged to those nights, which the poem does not dwell on. He went up onto the tree without it. He came down with it. The transaction was complete, and then there were the Volver, not one, but several across the span of the tradition. Odin summoned dead seers more than once, waking them from whatever rest the dead keep, and asking them the questions he could not answer otherwise. The Völva itself begins with exactly this summoning. The Völva addresses her audience. She asks for silence from all the high and low-born who wish to hear, and she begins. She speaks of what the world was before anything was made, and she speaks of what the world will be when everything is unmade. And the tradition holds that she is telling Odin things that he asked to hear, sitting across from her in the dark of a longhouse or the stranger dark of whatever space a summoned seeress speaks into, listening with the particular attention of someone who already understands, at some level, what he is about to be told. This is perhaps the most quietly unusual aspect of the whole structure. Odin, in the Norse tradition, already knows what Ragnarok holds for him. He knows the wolf's name. He knows how the battle ends, the sacrifice of his eye at Mimir's well, the hanging on Yggdrasil, the repeated summoning of dead seeresses. All of these are expressions of the same compulsion, but not toward ignorance, toward clarity. He is not trying to find a way to change what is coming. The tradition gives no indication that he believes the prophecy can be avoided, no indication that the foreknowledge is sought as a tool for prevention. What he seems to be seeking, across all these acts of painful and deliberate acquisition of prophetic knowledge, is something more like a complete understanding of the thing he is moving through, the shape of it in its totality, held clearly and without evasion. The Volva who speaks in the Voluspa is described as having knowledge that reaches in both directions, across time, back to the first giants, and forward past the burning of the worlds. She has been summoned from the dead, which means she is not telling Odin what she expects to happen or what she has reasoned out from available evidence. She is telling him what she knows, as one who exists outside the ordinary frame of living time, as one for whom past and future are both, in some sense, present. The specific nature of this knowledge is not explained in the poem. It does not need to be. The tradition holds that some kinds of knowing are available only to those who have passed through the threshold that death represents, just as some kinds of knowing were available to Odin only after 9 nights hanging between the living and the dead on the wood of Yggdrasil. What the seeress offers is not comfort, and it is not warning in the ordinary sense of a warning, something given so that the recipient can take action to prevent the warned of outcome. It is more like a full account. She tells him the shape of the whole thing, the beginning, the long middle, and the end that is also, in the Norse tradition's understanding, a kind of beginning. She speaks without rush. The firelight in the hall where she sits moves across the carved posts above her, catching the animal shapes, releasing them. The people around her are very quiet, and Odin listens with the attention of someone receiving, at last, in clear language, the thing he has been trying to see from a very great distance for a very long time. The tradition that produced this image, the god and the seeress, the question and its answer, the fire and the dark hall, and the slow, deliberate voice, was itself a living practice before it became a text. The Volvor of the Norse world were not legendary figures in their own time. They were practitioners of a recognized and respected, if somewhat unsettling, profession. They traveled, they performed their seances in the longhouses of the communities that invited them, surrounded by those who came to hear or who participated in the particular songs that the tradition associated with the Scyther ceremony. The payment they received was concrete: a meal, a place to sleep, sometimes a fee in silver, and the respect they received was also concrete, visible in the written sources that described them, in the grave goods found in burials that scholars identify as belonging to Volvir, the staffs and the pouches of herbs, and the other objects of the practice laid in alongside the body. This is one of the things that gives the opening framing of the Völuspá its particular quality. It is not a purely literary device, the dead seeress and the listening god. It is a literary elaboration of something that actually happened in Norse communities. The summoning, the seance, the long, careful process of the seeress reaching past the edge of ordinary knowing and bringing back what she found there. The poem takes this real practice, already saturated with cultural weight, and expands it to the largest possible scale. Not a farmer asking about the fate of his household, but a god asking about the fate of everything, and the seeress answering with equal precision and equal calm. Snorri Sturluson, sitting at his work in 13th century Iceland, writing down these traditions in the careful prose of the Gylfaginning, was engaged in his own version of a similar act. He was reaching back toward a tradition that was, in his time, not fully gone, but receding, present in the poems that were still circulating, in the skaldic verse that still used the old kennings, in the memory of a mythological world that Christianity had displaced, but not entirely erased from the cultural imagination of medieval Iceland. He wrote it down not as a believer, but as a scholar, which is to say, he brought to it a kind of respect that is not the same as reverence, but is not less serious for that. He pressed the old oral tradition into prose so that poets would understand the references their ancestors had used, so that a kenning involving Odin's ravens, or the mead of the gods, or the walls of Asgard would remain available as a living tool of the poetic language rather than calcifying into an opaque artifact. What Snorri could not fully preserve, and knew he could not, was the density of the original oral transmission, the way a single stanza of the Voluspa would have landed in the mind of a Viking Age audience, already furnished with all the knowledge the stanza assumed. He did what he could with what he had, and what he produced is one of the most valuable single documents for the study of Norse mythology that exists, alongside the Codex Regius manuscript itself. The two texts together, the compressed oral poetry of the Poetic Edda and the expansive prose synthesis of the Prose Edda, form the foundation of everything that can be said with any confidence about the Norse mythological tradition. Neither is complete. Neither is, in the technical sense, unmediated. The Voluspa was written down by a Christian scribe in a Christian Iceland 2 centuries after the official conversion, and the Prose Edda was composed by a scholar who was not himself a practitioner of the religion he was describing. What both preserve, however, is recognizably continuous with what the archaeological and runic evidence suggests about Norse religious practice in the preceding centuries. The same figures, the same events, the same underlying cosmological structure. The gaps and the compromises of transmission are real, and scholars argue about them continuously, but they do not erase the tradition. They are simply the particular shape of its survival. In the long house, the vulva has finished speaking, or perhaps she has reached the natural pause between one part of the account and the next, and the hall is silent around her. The fire has burned lower, the light is less active now, less given to catching the carved shapes on the posts and making them move. The people who gathered to hear her are still gathered, but something has settled in them, the particular quality of having been told something large, told it carefully, by someone whose composure in the telling was itself a kind of message. Odin is there. The tradition does not linger on his expression, or describe what he does with his hands while he listens, or say whether he asks questions or receives the seeress's account in silence. What it holds is that he listens, and that by the end of the listening, he knows what he came to know. The shape of the whole thing, from the beginning to the end, from the giants before the world was made, to the fire and the dark water and what comes after them, he knows what waits for him at the end of the long arc of events that the Velva has traced. And the tradition does not describe him as changed by this knowledge in the ways a person might expect, not broken by it, not paralyzed, not visibly altered in the direction he moves or the decisions he makes. He rose or will rise in the particular grammar of a tradition where time moves differently than it does in ordinary speech. He took what he had come for. He carried it with him as a thing that was now simply part of what he knew, held in the same way he held everything else he had worked to gain, the eye left in the dark water, the runes gathered from below the tree on the 9th night, the names of things that most of the living do not know. The foreknowledge of Ragnarok joined these, not as a wound, not as a sentence, but as information, the kind of information that changes the shape of the knowing mind, without necessarily changing the direction of the knowing mind's movement through the world. What the tradition offers in this image is something quieter than a lesson and more interesting than a warning. There is a God who knows, with as much certainty as the cosmos contains, how his story ends. He knows the name of what will kill him. He knows the day the great horn will sound. He has heard it from a dead woman sitting in firelight, speaking in the careful, unhurried voice of a practitioner who has done this before and knows that clarity serves better than comfort. And he leaves, carrying what he knows, and continues. The old calfskin pages of the Codex Regius hold this story in their dark ink, still legible after 7.5 centuries of being carried through the world by various hands. Snorri Sturluson's prose in the Galfaginning holds it in a different form, shaped by a scholar's need to make things clear and sequential and available to people who might otherwise have missed the thread. The vulva's voice, moving through the stanzas of the Voluspa, holds it in the oldest form available, compressed, elusive, dense with the particular economy of a tradition that trusted its audience to bring what was needed to the encounter. What they all preserve is the same image, approached from different distances, a god who sought the full shape of his own fate, who paid in the only currencies available to a being of his particular kind: pain, loss, time, the eye in the dark water, and who received, in exchange, not the ability to change what was coming, but the ability to see it clearly, to hold it in full, to continue forward into it without the particular difficulty of the unknown. The question the image leaves open is not the god's question. His question was asked and answered in that hall. The question that remains is quieter and has no figure attached to it. The question of what it costs to know completely, and whether knowing completely is in the end a kind of freedom or simply another form of carrying something heavy with both hands all the way to the end of the road. The Velva sits in the firelight. The hall is quiet. The carved wood above her holds its shapes in the moving light. Somewhere outside the hall, the Norse world continues in its ordinary motions. The sea, the ice, the long darkness of the northern winter, the stars in their courses, the ash tree Yggdrasil spreading its branches above all of it, its roots reaching down into the deep wells where the oldest things wait. And Odin walks away into the dark of that world, knowing what he knows, and the knowing neither stops him nor turns him back, but simply rides with him, as knowledge does, wherever he goes next. Snow fell in the middle of July, not the light, uncertain flurries that sometimes came to the higher Norse settlements in a late season, not the kind of cold that passed within a day and left the fields glistening and unharmed. This was snow that settled, snow that stayed, snow that covered the barley before it had any chance to ripen, that lay across the meadows in white, undisturbed sheets through what should have been the warmest weeks of the year, that pressed down on the roofs of the longhouses with a weight that had no business being there in midsummer. The rivers did not thaw that spring. The ice at the river banks, which in an ordinary year retreated through March and April in slow crumbling stages, simply held its position, and then, as autumn came around without any true summer having intervened, thickened again. The second winter settled over the first winter's snow without a single green week between them. This is what the Norse tradition describes as the beginning of Fimbulwinter. The word itself comes from Old Norse Fimbulvit, meaning the great winter, the mighty winter, the winter that is not a season but a condition. Snorri Sturluson, writing in Gulfag, beginning in the early 13th century, describes it in terms that are notable for their specificity. Not one severe winter, not a single season gone wrong in the way that seasons sometimes did in the northern latitudes where these stories were told and remembered. 3 winters, arriving in unbroken sequence with no summers between them. Snow driving in from all directions simultaneously. Frost gripping the entire world without remission, without the brief ordinary loosening that even the harshest winters in Norway and Iceland eventually allowed. The sun continued to rise and fall on its usual arc, but what it offered the earth was insufficient. Light without warmth, presence without consequence, the pale disk of it moving across a sky that remained the color of iron through every month of every year, of every winter, as they accumulated one against the next. To understand what three such winters would mean in practical terms, it helps to stay with the ordinary rhythm of life that they would disrupt. In a Norse farming settlement in the 9th or 10th century, the calendar was organized entirely around the brief, dense productivity of the Scandinavian summer. Hay was cut and dried in June and July for the animals to eat through the winter. Grain was sown in late spring and harvested before autumn arrived. Cattle that could not be fed through the cold months were slaughtered in autumn, their meat salted and stored. Every year turned on the reliable alternation of cold and warmth, and the cold season was manageable only because the warm one was real. Without summer, the hay was not cut. Without the hay, the animals could not be kept. Without the animals, the winter larder was empty before the ice had even set in earnest. Each failed summer compounded the effects of the one before it, and the tradition holds that this process ran for 3 full years without any interruption. The Norse sources do not dwell on what this meant for individual families and settlements in vivid detail. What the tradition preserves instead is the moral texture of what happened, the way that extreme scarcity changed the structure of human relationships, rather than simply the contents of the storeroom. The Voluspa, in a phrase that carries considerable weight in the Old Norse, describes the period of Fimbulwinter as Vindold, Viksold, age of wind, age of war, and what followed from the wind and the war, in the way that the poem tells it, was something quieter and more final than open battle. Brothers killed brothers. Fathers did not spare sons. Kinship bonds, which in Norse legal and personal life were not sentiment, but structure. The framework through which land was inherited, disputes were settled, obligations were fulfilled, and protection was extended to the vulnerable, were abandoned entirely. This detail matters more than it might first appear. In a Norse community, the bonds of kinship were functional in a way that is difficult to overstate. The thing, the legal assembly, operated through representation by family grouping, blood vengeance, and its negotiated settlement through weregild, the payment of compensation for injury or death, depended on the injured party having a kindred willing and able to act on their behalf. A man without family was a man without standing, without recourse, without the basic protection that Norse society extended to its members. When the Voluspa says that kinship bonds were abandoned, it is describing not merely a collapse of affection, but a collapse of the entire social architecture through which ordinary life was made possible. What remained after the kinship bonds failed was not merely scarcity, but a condition of social isolation so complete that the usual mechanisms for surviving scarcity, mutual aid, shared resources, cooperative labor, were no longer available to call on. The snow fell through all of this, and then it fell some more. There is a particular quality to the Fimbulwinter imagery that is worth staying with, the way it feels simultaneously enormous and very still. The tradition is not describing storms and catastrophe in the active dramatic sense. It is describing the removal of something, the removal of summer, the removal of warmth, the removal of the ordinary signs that the world was continuing to function as it always had, the first green shoots in the lower fields, the lengthening of evenings in late spring, the particular smell of thawing ground in March that told a Norse farmer the season had turned again. All of that simply absent, the world still present in its outlines, the mountains still where they had always been, the sea still moving at the coast, the sun still completing its arc from horizon to horizon, but the assurance that the warmth would come, which had always been there beneath every winter, which had never needed to be thought about because it had never failed, gone. Some scholars working in the mid-20th century and afterward began to look at what natural event might lie behind the Fimbulwinter tradition, what memory, encoded over generations of oral transmission, might have produced a myth of three sunless winters powerful enough to survive into the medieval manuscripts where it now rests. The Swedish dendrochronologist Lars Gunnar Franzen was among those who turned attention toward the climate deterioration of the mid-6th century, specifically the period between 536 and 539 CE. What caused this event is still discussed, but the evidence of it is not. Something, a massive volcanic eruption, an asteroid impact, or some combination of atmospheric disturbances, injected aerosols into the upper atmosphere in sufficient quantity to reduce solar radiation reaching the surface of the Earth across the entire northern hemisphere. The sky dimmed, the summers failed, the harvests collapsed. The tree rings hold this record. In Scandinavian forests, the growth rings laid down through the mid-6th century are narrow in a way that is visible to measurement and comparison. Bands of wood so thin that they represent seasons in which the trees could barely sustain themselves, let alone grow. These narrow rings are called, in the language of dendrochronology, stress rings, and across the forests of northern Europe, they correspond to what has been called the Late Antique Little Ice Age, a period of genuine agricultural collapse and population decline that left marks not only in wood, but in the archaeological record of settlements abandoned, food stores depleted, trade networks disrupted. The trees were there, they experienced whatever happened, and they recorded it in the grain of their growth with a precision that outlasted every human account of the same period by many centuries. The question of how a climatic catastrophe experienced in the 6th century might have entered oral tradition and eventually become part of the mythological inheritance recorded in the 13th century manuscripts is genuinely interesting, and it does not require a clean chain of direct transmission to be plausible. Oral tradition is not linear. Memories of great scarcity and great cold, the kind that reorganized a community's understanding of what could be lost and how quickly, have a tendency to become attached to the largest explanatory frameworks available, the frameworks that could hold the scale of what had happened without reducing it. In a Norse community already in possession of a cosmological story about a great winter that preceded the end of the world, a lived experience of 3 years of failed summers would have found its frame. The memory and the myth would have reinforced one another, each lending the other its particular kind of authority. Whether or not the specific memory of the 6th century climate crisis is woven into the Fimbulwinter tradition, what the tradition captures is something that feels genuinely observed. The texture of prolonged cold, the specific way that social bonds fail under sustained scarcity, the silence that settles over a world that has stopped renewing itself. These are details that carry the weight of experience. They are not the details of a tradition that has only imagined cold from a comfortable distance. And through all of this, through the 3 winters and the abandoned kinship bonds, and the snow that fell in July, and the fields that never softened, the wolves ran. Skurl and Hati are described in Snorri's account as offspring of a giantess in a forest east of Medith, a place called Ironwood, a name that suggests not merely a forest of very old trees, but a place where monstrous things were born and where they grew, undisturbed, at the margin of the ordered world. Skurl's quarry was the sun, Hati's was the moon. From the very beginning of creation, from the first day the sun and moon were placed in the sky and set moving across it, the wolves had been running behind them, not gaining ground, not losing it, simply maintaining the distance, close enough for the chase to be real, far enough that day after day, and year after year, and century after century, the sun moved across the sky and set and rose again and moved again, and the wolf was always there behind it, always exactly as far behind as it had been the day before. This image has a quality that is easy to pass over too quickly. The chase between Skrull and the sun was not a dramatic pursuit in the sense of an active hunt, with the wolf closing and the sun fleeing, and the tension of the gap between them changing moment by moment. It was a permanent condition of the sky. Every human being who had ever looked up at the sun moving across the arc of the heavens was, in the Norse understanding of the world, looking at something being chased. Not visibly chased. The wolf is not described as directly visible behind the sun in the way that a hunter might be visible behind a deer, but present, following, maintaining the distance that it had maintained since the first day the sun existed, with a patience that was not a virtue, but simply a feature of the wolf's particular nature, as fixed and impersonal as the path the sun itself traveled. Hati pursued the moon in the same way. Through its full monthly cycle of waxing and waning, the moon was never alone in the sky. The wolf behind it was not gaining, it was simply there. The Norse tradition does not say what the wolves thought about this arrangement, or whether they were aware of how long the chase had been going on. It is not that kind of story. But the tradition does say clearly what finally happened at the onset of Ragnarok. The distance closed. Whatever force had maintained the gap between the wolf and the sun across all the long centuries of the world's middle age, the orderly interval that had kept the sky populated with its moving lights and the earth warmed by their presence, that force failed. Skrull caught the sun. The tradition's language is direct about this. The wolf swallowed it. The sun was gone, not blocked, not dimmed, gone, taken inside the body of the wolf that had always been running just behind it, and the sky where it had been was simply dark. But he took the moon at the same moment, or near enough to it that the distinction does not matter, both lights extinguished, both sources of the sky's illumination removed at once, not gradually, the kind of darkness that results from two absences occurring simultaneously, is absolute in a way that the darkness of a cloudy night is not. The world that had already been living through 3 winters of failing warmth now had no skylight at all. The pale disk that had been moving across the iron-gray sky of Fimbulwinter, offering light if not warmth, was simply no longer there. There is something important about the timing. The wolves did not begin their chase as an omen of Ragnarok, or in response to Fimbulwinter, or because the end of the world was coming. They had been running since the beginning. The end of the world did not cause Skrull to pursue the sun. It only supplied the condition under which the chase finally succeeded. The wolf's patient, long-maintained distance simply collapsed. A thing that had always been happening finally completed itself. The Norse sources present this without urgency, without the language of sudden violence. The wolf ran. For as long as the world had existed, the wolf ran, and then the wolf arrived. To stand in that darkness, to try to inhabit the image the tradition is offering, requires staying with the specific quality of what had already been lost before the light went. The warmth had been failing for 3 winters. The grain had not grown. The animals could not be kept. The kinship bonds had frayed and broken. The social structures that made life possible in the ordinary sense had dissolved under the sustained pressure of scarcity and isolation. By the time the wolves finally closed the distance they had maintained since the first day, the world had already been changed in every way that can be changed by cold and hunger and the breakdown of trust between people who depend on one another. The darkness was the last element of what had always been assumed to be permanent and reliable, simply failing to remain. The long houses were still there, the mountains were still where they had always been, the sea still moved at the coast, but the sky above all of it was now dark in a way it had never been dark before. Not the dark of night, which always carried within it the certainty of morning, but the dark of an absence with no schedule for its resolution. Something that had been running behind the sun since the first day it existed had finally caught it, and the sun was gone. The cold that followed was not the cold of Fimbulwinter, which was intense and prolonged, but still the cold of a world in which the sun existed and was simply failing to warm the earth adequately. This was a different order of cold, the cold of a world in which no heat source remained in the sky, in which whatever warmth had been stored in the ground and the water and the stone would now simply drain away into air that received it without returning anything. The Norse tradition does not describe this in the language of temperature. It describes it in the language of darkness and silence, which suggests that what the sources are trying to convey is not the physical mechanism of heat loss, but the experiential quality of a world that has been stripped of its organizing principle. The sun was, in the Norse cosmological understanding, more than a source of warmth. It was a sign that the world was still functioning as it had been made to function, that the arrangement the gods had established at the beginning of time, the placement of the lights in the sky, and the setting of them in motion, was still in effect. As long as the sun moved and the wolf ran behind it without catching it, the world was still under the governance of that original arrangement. When the wolf closed the distance, what ended was not merely the light, but the assurance that the ordered world was still operating by its own rules. The chase had always been a sign of the world's continuation. Its completion was a sign of the world's ending, and yet the ending did not arrive all at once. Fimbulwinter had been a gradual process, 3 winters accumulating, each one compounding the damage of the last, the effects spreading slowly through the fabric of agricultural and social life before becoming total. Even the swallowing of the sun and moon, decisive as it was in cosmological terms, did not immediately resolve everything into a single moment of finality. The Norse tradition is interested in the accumulation, in the way that the signs of ending built on one another over time, each one arriving with its own specific character, each one adding its weight to what had come before. Fimbulwinter was the environmental harbinger, the condition that altered the world's texture before anything more dramatic occurred. The darkness that followed the wolves' completion of their long chase was the moment at which the alteration became irreversible in the sky itself. Between those two moments, the slow gray failing of the warmth and the sudden absolute dark of the swallowed lights, there is a quality of stillness that the tradition seems to understand as significant. Not the stillness of peace or resolution, but the stillness of a world that has been emptied of its ordinary noise and motion and warmth, that is now simply present in the dark and cold, waiting. The Norse word for this kind of waiting is not provided in the sources directly. The sources are not given to reflection on their own emotional textures in the way that a modern narrator might be. But the texture is there in the images they preserve. The snow falling in July, the kinship bonds failing in the dark, the wolves maintaining their patient eternal distance across the sky until they do not, the last light fading from a world that had already lost almost everything else that had made it recognizable. The night that the tradition describes at the end of Fimbulwinter, if it can be called a night, since it had no morning within sight, had a particular quality, not the comfortable dark of a clear winter evening when the stars at least are bright and the snow reflects whatever light comes from the sky. not the dramatic dark of a storm which carries with it the promise of clearing. The dark after the wolves completed their chase was simply complete, in the way that an absence is complete, not charged with anything, not leading anywhere in particular, not a pause between things, but a condition in its own right. The hearth fires in the longhouses still burned. Fire, at least, remained. The living still needed warmth in whatever form they could maintain it, and there was wood, and there was the knowledge of how to make fire, and so the hearths continued. But the light they gave was small and interior, contained within the spaces the living occupied, unable to reach the sky, or warm the ground, or do anything about the dark that had settled beyond the walls. For a people whose sense of time was organized around the movement of the sun, who named the days of the week after gods associated with the heavenly bodies, who celebrated the winter solstice as the turning point from which the light would return, whose entire agricultural calendar was calibrated to the sun's angle and the length of the day. The absence of the sun was not merely uncomfortable, it was the removal of the calendar itself. The organizing principle of time had been swallowed. The Norse tradition holds all of this without alarm, in the way that a very old story holds things, with the distance that comes not from indifference, but from the fact of having been told and retold across many generations, each retelling settling the images a little more firmly into the particular quality they carry now. Fimbulwinter is not described by the sources as a tragedy in the personal sense. Individual families and their specific suffering are not named. What the tradition preserves is the structural shape of the disaster, the sequence of its elements, the way one failure led to another, the particular order in which the things that held the world together came apart. 3 winters, no summer, the kinship bonds, the age of wind, the age of war, and then the wolves arriving at what they had always been moving toward. The earth was still there beneath all of it. The mountains had not moved. The longhouses had not fallen. The sea was still the sea. Everything that had been made at the beginning of the world, the careful assembly of land and sky and water, the placement of the lights in their courses, the establishment of the realms and their boundaries, was still present in outline, even if what had always been moving within that outline had now stopped or changed or gone dark. The world that had been made was still mostly intact as a structure. It was simply very cold and very still, and the sky above it was empty of everything that had made it recognizable as sky. The wolves had completed their errand, patient and absolute and unhurried, at the end of the longest chase the world had ever contained. What they had always been running toward, they had reached. The sun was gone, the moon was gone, and the world that remained was held in the vast cold dark that follows the swallowing of the last light, present still, but waiting, very still and very cold in the silence of something enormous that had just finished. In Valhalla, before the light has changed, and before anything has yet been set in motion, a rooster opens its throat and crows. Its name is Glenkambi, the golden-combed, and the sources describe it as perched somewhere among the gilded rafters of Odin's great hall, its comb catching whatever passes for morning in a place that does not age toward morning the way the world below it does. The sound it makes carries through Valhalla's vast interior, down the length of those 540 doors, out across the plains where the Einherjar have spent another night in the particular, habitual readiness of warriors who have been preparing for the same battle since before they can remember. Glenkambi crows to wake them, and somewhere in the same moment, not after, not before, but in the precise simultaneity that the Norse sources hold as important, a second rooster opens its throat in a completely different world. This one has no name that survives in the sources. What survives is its color, rust red, the color of old iron, of something that has been kept in a place without light for a very long time. It crows in Hela, in the dim expanse that lies beneath the roots of Yggdrasil and below the lowest threshold of the world, the living inhabit. The army it is waking is the army of the dead, not the Einherjar, who died in battle and were carried to Valhalla by the Valkyries, but the ones who died otherwise, who came down the long road to hell by illness, or by age, or by the thousand other ways a life can end that do not involve a sword. They stir in the gray light of that place, and the rust-red rooster's cry fades into the deep stillness of their country. And in Jotunheim, in the cold open expanse of the giant's world to the east of Midgard, a third rooster crows. His name is Fjalar, and the sources describe him as red, a different red, more vivid than the rust of the nameless bird in hell, something with more fire in it. He crows to rouse the giants, and the Norse sources place him simply in Jotunheim without specifying where, as though the exact location matters less than the fact of the crowing itself. The fact that in three distinct realms, in three distinct directions, three distinct voices are announcing the same thing at the same moment, and none of the three can hear the others, and none needs to. What is striking about these three birds, and what the tradition seems to have found worth preserving across the centuries of telling that lie between their origin and the manuscript pages that record them, is precisely this quality of simultaneous, separate announcement. Gulinkambi does not know Valar is crowing. The rust-red bird in Hela has no awareness of either of the others. Each sounds its alarm into its own world, toward its own army, and the three notes never combine into a single chord that anyone can hear entire. The sign of Ragnarok's coming is not one sound, but three sounds happening at once in places separated by the entire breadth of the Norse cosmos, and only someone who could hear all three together would understand what was beginning. That separation has its own particular quality. In the Norse sources, the worlds of the cosmos, Valhalla and Hel, and Jotunheimer and Midgardr and the rest, are not stacked like floors in a single building. They are arranged in a more complex relation to one another, connected by the great tree whose roots and branches reach everything, but not equivalent, not interchangeable, not able to hear each other's roosters. The simultaneous crowing is cosmological, not acoustic. It is a structure, not a sound. Far away from all three crowing birds, in a cave whose location the sources do not specify precisely, but which is understood to lie somewhere beneath the world, a man has been held for a long time. His name is Loki, and the circumstances of his imprisonment are described across several sources with a consistency that suggests the story was well settled in the tradition before anyone wrote it down. After a series of transgressions, the most consequential being his role in the death of the god Baldr, radiant and beloved, Loki was brought to a cave and bound there by the gods, using the entrails of his own son Narfi, who was killed for this purpose. The bonds, which had been the organs of a living person, were hardened by the gods into something like iron in the binding. 3 flat stones were set to support his body in different places, at his shoulders, at his hips, at the backs of his knees, and the Norse sources describe him lying in this position in the dark, held. Above him, a serpent was fastened to a stalactite, or to the rock of the cave ceiling, in such a way that its venom drips in a continuous thread downward toward Loki's face. Left alone, the venom would strike him directly, and its burning is described in the sources as extraordinary, not a physical pain exactly, but something that shakes the earth. Loki's wife, Sigyn, stands beside him in the cave. She holds a bowl above his face and catches the falling drops. The posture she holds is the posture of someone performing an act of sustained, attentive care. Still, upright, the bowl precisely placed, her attention on the thread of venom above her and on her husband's face below it. She does not leave. She holds the bowl steady, but the bowl fills. It must be emptied. And when Sigyn turns aside to empty it, when the brief, practical, necessary interval arrives during which she carries the full bowl away from beneath the serpent's mouth, the venom falls freely onto Loki's face. What happens then, according to the Norse mythological understanding of the world, is that Loki's convulsions of pain are felt in the earth above. The ground somewhere shifts and settles. The ordinary geological fact of an earthquake is in this account the involuntary movement of a god who has been given no way to hold still. The Prose Edda records this explanation and treats it as settled. Loki lies in the cave, and Sigyn holds the bowl, and the earth moves when she cannot hold it fast. There is something in this image that the Norse tradition seems to have found both structurally important and worth preserving in precise detail. Not just the imprisonment itself, which could have been summarized, but the specific arrangement of stones, the specific placement of the serpent, the specific action of Sigyn with the bowl, and the specific consequence when she must look away. The detail accumulates into something that feels less like punishment and more like mechanism. The cave is not incidental. The bowl is not incidental. The interval of Sigyn's turning is not incidental. Each element is part of a careful construction whose purpose, among other things, is to explain something the Norse understood to happen in the physical world, and also to establish that Loki remains present in the structure of things, bound but not eliminated, shaking the ground from below, waiting. And what Loki is waiting for, though the sources do not have him speak this expectation directly, is the moment when the bonds will break. The Gylfaginning describes his release as coinciding with the onset of Ragnarok itself. The cave that holds him is a kind of patience. The bowl that catches the venom is a kind of postponement. And the earthquakes that register his pain are, in this framework, a kind of clock, not measuring out days, but marking the persistence of the force that will eventually need to go somewhere, and will, considerably further away. In Svartalfheim, the realm associated with the dwarves, the product of a very particular act of craft, sits at the center of one of the Norse tradition's most carefully constructed episodes. Its name is Gleipnir, and the sources describe it in terms that seem designed to make its nature difficult to hold in mind all at once. It is not a chain, it is not a rope, it is not what any natural craftsman working with natural materials would produce. What the dwarves made, according to Snorri's account, was something that looks like a silken ribbon, narrow, smooth, light enough to lie loosely across a hand, and which has no structural resemblance to anything that could plausibly restrain one of the largest and most powerful creatures in the Norse cosmos. This is entirely deliberate. The Norse sources specify that Gleipnir was made from 6 ingredients, and every one of them is something that does not exist. The sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, and the spittle of a bird. Each ingredient was possible to gather precisely because none of them could be found. The sound that a cat's feet make on a floor, that soft, particular, inaudible pad, cannot be collected, cannot be put into a vessel, cannot be worked into a cord. And because the dwarves gathered it, it is no longer there. Cats, the sources note, now make no sound when they walk. The ingredients of Gleipnir are the absences they left behind. What Gleipnir was made to restrain is the wolf Fenrir, one of Loki's three monstrous children by the giantess Angrboda, and described in the Norse sources as enormous even by the standards of his particular and remarkable lineage. The gods had kept Fenrir in Asgard as a young wolf, raising him among themselves, and the sources record that only Tyr had the courage to approach him, to feed him, to maintain the careful relationship that kept Fenrir manageable. But the wolf grew. He grew past the point at which the gods could contain him through ordinary means, and through ordinary means they tried, bringing him two successive chains, each one described as heavy and strong. Each one Fenrir broke from his limbs with a single flex when the gods asked him to test his strength against them. The third attempt required a different kind of thought. The dwarves of Svartalfheim were commissioned, and they made Gleipnir from the gathered absences of the world, and the gods took it to Fenrir on an island in a lake, and asked him once more to test his strength against a bond. Fenrir looked at the ribbon. He understood, in the way the sources suggest he understood most things, that something about this particular ribbon was not what it appeared to be. He agreed to be bound by it on one condition, that one of the gods place a hand in his mouth as a pledge of good faith, as a sign that if Gleipnir proved impossible to break, the gods would release him. The sources record that the gods looked at one another, and that Tyr placed his hand in the wolf's mouth. Gleipnir held. The gods did not release Fenrir. Tyr's hand was bitten off at the wrist, and the sources record this plainly as the price of a necessary deception and as the origin of a wound that Tyr carries permanently. Fenrir was bound on the island, tethered by a cord attached to a great boulder, a sword wedged open in his jaws so that he would not be able to close them until the end of the world, when the bonds of Gleipnir finally give way and he runs free. What Gleipnir actually is in its structure, in the logic of its making, turns out to be one of the more interesting things in the Norse mythological system. The dwarves did not make a stronger chain. They made something that operates by a different principle entirely. The natural materials of the world, iron, rope, leather, can be broken by a force large enough, because force and material exist in the same system and can be set against each other. But Gleipnir is made of things that no longer exist, which means it has no surface in common with the forces inside the world. Fenrir cannot break it for the same reason he cannot grab a handful of cat silence or snap the rootlessness of a mountain. The thing is not there to be broken. The only reason it can eventually fail is that the world itself is failing, that at Ragnarok, the conditions under which Gleipnir maintains its particular quality of not quite existing begin to unravel along with everything else. The ribbon holds until holding is no longer the nature of things. Across the Norse mythological cosmos, in a place the sources associate with the realm of the dead, a ship has been under construction for a very long time. Its name is Nagfar, and the Prose Edda describes it as the largest ship ever made. This would be remarkable enough if its size were simply a function of how much wood and how much time had gone into it. What makes Nagfar what it is? What makes it something worth having its own name in the tradition, worth appearing by name in the Völuspá, is the material it is made from. Naglfar is built from the fingernails and toenails of the dead, not their bones, not their hair, their nails, the hard keratin-dense crescents at the ends of fingers and toes, cut or uncut, taken at death. The ship grows as the dead accumulate, one small curved fragment at a time. The Prose Edda contains a specific instruction for the living that follows directly from this. The nails of the dead must be cut before burial, because material contributed to Naglfar's hull at death becomes part of its construction. and a ship built faster for more material reaches completion sooner, and Naglfar's completion is a marker of Ragnarok's arrival. This detail, the cutting of nails as cosmological practice, as a small domestic ritual, whose stakes are nothing less than the timing of the world's end, has a quality that appears in several places in Norse mythological thinking, a quality of the vast and the ordinary cohabiting in the same action. The person who trims the nails of the body, laid out for burial, is not performing a symbolic gesture. In the Norse understanding, they are genuinely slowing the construction of a ship that will eventually carry the armies of chaos to the final battle. The kitchen knife or the small iron implement used for nail trimming becomes, in this framework, a tool with cosmological relevance. The living have their hands in the architecture of the world's ending in the most literal and unexpected way. Naglfar's crew and captain vary slightly between sources. Snorri's Gylfaginning gives the helm to Frem, a giant, and describes the ship setting sail from the east when the bonds of the world finally loosen. The Völuspá is briefer, mentioning the ship but dwelling less on its passenger manifest. What both sources share is the image of the hull itself, enormous, built over an unimaginable span of time from a material that accumulates slowly and that the living can, in small increments, reduce. The ship exists at the intersection of the cosmic and the intimate. Its construction is a geological process. Its raw material is clipped at kitchen tables and by the light of tallow candles, and in the preparation of the dead for burial, one small piece at a time. There is an odd patience in the image of Naglfar that does not appear in the rooster's simultaneous crowing or in Gleipnir's elegant impossibility. The roosters crow all at once, which is a single decisive moment. Gleipnir was made in a specific act of craft and will fail in a specific moment. Naglfar has been building since the first person died, and it will keep building until either the world ends or everyone alive, forever after, remembers to cut the nails of their dead. The ship is not a countdown so much as a collaboration between the dying and the living, between the domestic and the cosmological, between the small rituals that the Norse sources held as genuinely consequential and the vast structural forces operating beneath the surface of the world. When Naglfar finally sails, the sources describe it as crewed not just by giants from Hrum's direction, but by the dead who had been gathering along Hell's shore. The rust-red rooster had already woken them. The ship they are boarding has been made, in some small part, from their own material. Beneath everything, beneath Valhalla and Hel and Jotunheimr and Midgard and the cave where Loki lies and the island where Fenrir waits and the shore where Naglfar sits, heavy in the gray water, there is the tree. Its name is Yggdrasil, and the Norse sources describe it as an ash of extraordinary scale, not tall so much as total, its canopy reaching above the highest of the 9 worlds, and its 3 roots plunging down into 3 separate wells at the foundations of the cosmos. One root reaches the well of earth, where the Norns sit and weave the fates of gods and men, the water of which they use to keep Yggdrasil's bark from rotting. One root reaches the well of Mimir, from which Odin drank wisdom at the cost of his eye. One root reaches Hvergelmir, the roaring spring in Niflheim, from which the primal rivers once flowed. The tree touches and sustains and connects everything. Where the squirrel Ratatoskris carries gossip between the eagle at the top of the tree and the serpent Nithhug gnawing at its roots at the bottom, the whole structure becomes something like a vertical world map, with life and light at the crown, decay and depth at the base, and everything that exists arranged along the span between. The Norse sources are attentive to the ways that Yggdrasil is threatened. Nidhogr gnaws its roots from below. Stags graze the branches from above, eating the new growth as it comes. The tree is described as existing in a state of continuous repair. The Norns water it from Earthry's well, pack clay around its bark to keep it from drying and splitting, and do this work daily, an ongoing maintenance of the structure that supports the cosmos. The tree persists, not because it is invulnerable, but because there are agents working continuously to keep it whole. When the signs that precede Ragnarok accumulate to the point where they are unmistakable, Yggdrasil begins to tremble. The sources describe this in terms that are careful not to claim the tree falls or breaks or burns. Not yet. What happens at the approach of Ragnarok is not the destruction of Yggdrasil, but its trembling, the shaking of something enormous that is still present, still holding, still connecting the 9 worlds at their roots and crowns, but that has begun to feel the forces working against its foundations in a way that it can no longer entirely absorb. The Norse vocabulary the sources use for this is worth attending to. The tree groans, it shudders, it moves in the way that large old trees move in strong wind, perceptibly, heavily, the whole mass of it shifting slightly, in a way that communicates that whatever is happening to it is happening all the way down to the deepest root. In a tradition as attentive to Yggdrasil's importance as the Norse sources are, this trembling carries weight that a description of any other object trembling would not. The tree is not merely a large tree, it is the structure within which everything that exists exists. Its roots are in the wells that contain wisdom and fate, and the origins of the world's rivers. Its branches shelter the worlds in their arrangements. The creatures that live on it, the eagle, the squirrel, the 4 stags, Nidhogr and the deep, are not there incidentally, but are part of the system it maintains by simply being. When it trembles, the trembling is felt in every realm simultaneously, in the same way that the 3 roosters crowing happen simultaneously in their separate worlds. But unlike the roosters, whose simultaneous sounding was a sign meant to be noticed by the armies that needed to wake, the trembling of Yggdrasil is not a signal sent to any particular army. It is the cosmos registering in its own material that something has changed in its foundations. The Völuspá describes Yggdrasil in a stanza that appears near the moment when the final sequence of events begins to unfold, and Snorri's Gylfaginning draws on this and other sources to construct its account. What both sources convey is that the tree's trembling is not a symptom of a single cause, but an expression of the cumulative weight of everything that has been weakening the world's structure, the long winter without summer, the breaking of bonds that were made to hold, the release of forces that had been carefully, artificially restrained. The tree is responding to everything all at once. There is a particular quality to this image, an enormous and ancient thing, still standing, still intact in its vast canopy and its deep roots, but shaking from within, that the Norse mythological tradition returns to repeatedly in describing the approach of endings and transformations. The ash does not fall at the onset of Ragnarok. The sources are specific about this. What falls are the bridges, the walls, the particular structures that the gods built. What shakes and trembles is the larger structural substrate that those built things rested on. The distinction matters because it tells the listener something about how the Norse sources understood the difference between what was made and what was simply there. Between Asgard, which was constructed by a giant at the dawn of the world, and Yggdrasil, which the sources treat as having been there before Asgard, before the gods themselves, perhaps before everything. The dragon Nidhogr gnaws its roots. It has been doing this since the beginning. The stags eat its new growth. They have been doing this since the beginning. The Norns carry water from Urther's well to pour on the roots. They do not stop. Whether they stop at the onset of Ragnarok, or whether the tree trembles because they cannot carry enough water fast enough to counteract what Nidhogr has finally worn through, this the sources do not specify. The mechanism of the trembling is less important in the end than its quality. The entire structure of the nine worlds has begun to move. In the Norse tradition's understanding of the cosmos, the nine realms are not isolated chambers. They are connected by Yggdrasil's roots and branches, by Bifrost the rainbow bridge, by the roads that the gods and the giants and the messengers of the dead use to travel between them. When Yggdrasil trembles, the movement passes through every connection it maintains. The roots in Urthra's well shudder in the cold water. The branches above the worlds sway against the sky of each world in turn. The eagle at the crown of the tree that has been watching the horizon since creation feels the movement beneath it. The serpent Nidhogr at the base, still gnawing, feels the whole weight of the tree shift above the place where its teeth are working. The squirrel Ratatoskr, running its endless vertical path between these two, with its messages of insult and grievance, runs on a track that is no longer entirely still. The roosters have crowed in their three worlds. Loki's wife holds the bull steady in the cave. Gleipnir still holds the wolf on the island in the lake. Nogfar sits in the dark water growing heavier, nail by nail and year by year, and Yggdrasil stands across all of it, above all of it, through all of it, its bark still sound, its canopy still wide, its roots still reaching the wells that mark the deep boundaries of the known cosmos. The tree is not falling, it is not broken, it is simply, unmistakably, for the first time in the memory of everything that has ever lived in its branches or beneath its shade, beginning to shake. The sound it makes, if sound is the right word for what an ash tree produces, when its roots shudder and its branches sway and the whole vast structure registers in every grain of its wood that something in the foundations of the world has finally shifted, is not the sound of destruction. It is closer to the sound of something very large that has been perfectly still for a very long time, adjusting, a settling, a groan that is felt more than heard, that moves through the worlds not as noise, but as the kind of movement that makes the water in a bowl ripple without anyone touching the bowl. The worlds feel it, everything that lives in them feels it. And then the tree stands still again, or nearly still, its canopy moving faintly in whatever passes for wind at the top of the Norse cosmos, its roots deep in their wells, its bark still whole, its wood still carrying the load of everything that has always rested on it, intact, present, still connecting the bright crown of the world to its deepest roots, still the structure within which everything else is arranged. The trembling has passed through it, and it is still standing, and whatever the trembling meant, whatever its quality as an announcement, as a harbinger, as the physical expression of forces too large for any single place to contain, the tree holds it in its wood, the way wood holds everything, absolutely and without comment. The sign has passed through the world like a long, slow note that every realm heard in its own particular silence. The roosters crowed in their separate dark. The earth shifted once above the cave, where Sigurd's bowl grew briefly full. The ribbon on the wolf's limbs held its impossible, absent substance hold. The hull of Naglfar settled fractionally lower in the water with the weight of its long accretion. And Yggdrasil, standing at the center of all of it, the ash whose roots touch wisdom and fate and the deep cold springs of the world's beginning, stood and shook and stood again, its vast canopy still spread above the nine worlds, its deepest roots still reaching down through the rock and the darkness to the water below, everything, the whole enormous structure of it, still there, still holding, trembling in the enormous charged quiet of what has not yet arrived. Gjallarhorn had rested at Heimdall's side since the first morning of the world, through all the long age of the gods, through the wars, the building, the slow accumulation of everything the Aesir had made, and named, and set in motion. The horn had waited there, a curved and resonant instrument that everyone who knew its purpose had hoped, in a quiet and persistent way, would never be needed. Heimdall was the watchman of the gods, the one who stood at the edge of Bifrost, with eyesight that extended to the ends of the world, and hearing so acute that he could perceive the sound of grass growing in the fields below Asgard and wool forming on the backs of sheep. He had watched the realms for longer than any accounting could measure. He had watched and waited and kept the horn beside him, and now the morning came when he raised it to his lips, and the first note cut through the cold air above the rainbow bridge with a clarity that carried no ambiguity at all. The Prose Edda, composed by Snorri Sturluson in Iceland around 1220 CE, describes the blowing of Gjallarhorn, whose name means something close to the horn that resounds through the air, as the formal signal of Ragnarok's beginning. Its sound does not build. It arrives complete, a single sustained note that every living thing within range of its resonance understands immediately and without explanation. The tradition holds that Odin had known this moment was coming for a very long time. Before the horn sounded, according to the Völuspá, the great prophetic poem that forms the cornerstone of the Poetic Edda, Odin turned one last time to consult Mimir's head, the severed, preserved head of a being so wise that the god had visited its council throughout the entire mythological age. What Mimir said in that last consultation, the sources do not record. What the detail suggests is a brief pause, a god who already knew everything the prophecy contained, seeking confirmation of what he already understood, the space of a breath between the moment Gjallarhorn sounded and the moment the irreversible truly began. The warriors of Valhalla had been preparing for this their entire existence within those golden walls. Snorri's account in Gelfaginning describes Valhalla as a hall with 540 doors, each one wide enough that 800 warriors could march abreast through the opening. Through all of them, simultaneously, the Einherjar emerged, the chosen dead, the warriors gathered over ages precisely for this purpose, armed and ordered, and stepping out into a sky that had already begun to change. They had trained every day of their time in Valhalla, fighting and dying and being restored, the long rehearsal of a battle whose date they were always moving toward. Now the date had come, and the Einherjar walked out into the gray light of a world in the last hours of its particular form, and there was nothing in the tradition's description of their emergence that suggests disorder. They came out through 540 doors in the same deliberate way they had done everything else, prepared, unhurried, ready in the only way that preparation for something genuinely final can ever make anyone ready. Odin rode at their head on Sleipnir, the eight-legged horse born from Loki's shapeshifting, and the stallion Svadtilfari, a gray horse that moved between the worlds with an ease no other creature possessed, and whose 8 legs struck the ground in a rhythm that the Norse imagination associated with the processional pace of a funeral, the cadence of something being carried to its final place. Odin carried the spear Gungnir, which had been forged by the sons of Ivaldi in the workshops of Svartalfheim, and which was said never to miss its mark. He wore his wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He rode toward the plain of Vigrid, the field where the Norse tradition locates the final battle. A plain described as stretching 100 leagues in every direction, vast enough to contain the last engagement of every force in the 9 worlds, large enough that even the armies of giants and gods could be lost in the space between its edges. The plain of Vigrid was not empty when the Einherjar arrived. From the other direction came the forces that had been building and waiting since long before the first winter of the Great Cold. Hrym, the frost giant, came steering the ship Naglfar, that immense vessel built over generations from the fingernails and toenails of the dead, the largest ship the Norse tradition knew of, now fully completed and sailing across the floodwaters that the great winter had produced. Muspelheim's forces came from the south under Surtur, the fire giant who had stood at the boundary of that fire realm since before the world was shaped, his sword blazing with a light described in the Völuspá as brighter than the sun. The world serpent Jormungand rose from the ocean it had encircled since Odin cast it there in the world's early age, its emergence churning the seas into the waves that swelled beneath Nagfar's hull. And Fenrir, the wolf bound on the island of Lyngvi with the ribbon-like fetter Gleipnir, the wolf who had been held since the gods first understood what the prophecies said his freedom would mean, had already broken free. His mouth, according to Snorri's account, gaped so wide when he ran that his upper jaw scraped the sky and his lower jaw dragged along the earth, and would have opened wider still had there been room between the sky and the ground to accommodate it. The Battle of Ragnarok, as the Norse sources structure it, is not a chaotic mass engagement. It resolves into a series of paired individual combats, each one fulfilling a long-standing prophetic rivalry, each pair meeting the other as though pulled together by the same gravity that had been drawing them across the entire span of the mythological age. The pairings were known. They had been prophesied. Every figure on that plane understood, in the way that one understands a pattern that has been completing itself across a very long sequence, exactly which adversary they were moving toward. Odin and Fenrir met on the field, the wolf that had grown too large for any chain the gods could forge, the wolf that had swallowed the light and now ran across Vigrid with his jaws open wide enough to contain a world. Odin faced it on Sleipnir with the spear Gungnir leveled. The tradition holds that Odin drove the spear into the wolf's body, and that Fenrir swallowed him, not defeated him, swallowed him. The Völuspá describes it with the same measured economy it brings to every event in the battle. Odin falls to the wolf. The details of what those final moments were like for the Allfather, what he thought, what he felt, what it meant to know this was coming and to ride toward it regardless. The tradition does not offer. What it preserves instead is the structural fact of the loss. The oldest of the gods, the one who had sacrificed his eye at Mimir's well and hung 9 nights on Yggdrasil for the runes, the one who had sought knowledge of this very moment through every means available to him, met the thing he had known was coming and was taken by it. There is a completeness to this in the way the Norse tradition tells it that sits differently from defeat. It is the closing of something that had been open for a very long time. Vidar, Odin's son, avenged his father almost immediately. He was one of the gods the prophecy had set apart as a survivor, and his purpose on that field was singular. The sources describe him as wearing a thick shoe, a boot made from all the leather scraps that cobblers had ever trimmed away, a shoe built by the accumulated small discards of a craft practiced across the entire human age, every unused piece saved for this single application. With this boot, Viklar stepped on Fenrir's lower jaw and took the upper jaw in his hand and tore the wolf apart. The image the tradition offers is specific and deliberate. The wolf that had swallowed the father of the gods, killed by the sun, with footwear assembled from humanity's ordinary leavings, the cosmic defeat answered by an instrument made from the most mundane material imaginable. On another part of the plain, Thor and Jormungandr finally completed the pursuit that had defined their relationship since the beginning of the world. Thor, the red-bearded god of thunder, had encountered the world serpent before, once at the hall of the giant Utgarthur Loki, in a fishing contest from which he had nearly pulled Jormungandr from the sea before the giant cut the line, and once in a wrestling match where the serpent, disguised as an old woman, had brought him to one knee. Now the serpent had risen from the ocean and stood before him without disguise, full-sized, exhaling its venom into the air between them, the confrontation that had been circling toward its conclusion since the first age of the gods. Thor swung Mjolnir, the hammer that had returned to his hand across every distance he had thrown it, came down on the serpent with the full weight of the thunder god's strength behind it. Jormungandr died from the blow. Then Thor took 9 steps and fell. The venom was already in him. The serpent's poison had been flooding the air and ground around their fight, and the 9 steps Thor managed after the killing blow are a detail that the Norse tradition has preserved across 1,000 years of telling, with a care that speaks to how much the exact count mattered. Not 8 steps, not 10, 9, the number that carries a particular weight in the Norse cosmological imagination. The same count of nights Odin hung on Yggdrasil, the same structural unit that measured sacred intervals throughout the tradition. 9 steps, the hammer still in his hand, the serpent dead on the ground behind him, and then the thunder god, who had defended Midgard from the threats that pressed against it from Jotunheim through the entire span of the mythological world, went down in the poison-flooded grass of Vigrathr. His sons Magni and Mothi, strength and courage, their names carrying the qualities they embodied, were among the survivors the tradition names as carrying something of what was lost forward into whatever came next. Freyr's combat was among the most particular of the battle's several particular losses, because the tradition has preserved not only its outcome, but its cause. Freyr, the Vanir god of fertility and sunlight, and the turning seasons, the god whose goodwill the Norse agricultural world depended on for the harvest, and whose name was spoken at weddings and over the first planting of each year. Freyr faced Surtur on the plain of Vigrathr without the sword that could have saved him. Snorri's account in Gylfaginning is specific about why. Freyr had once sent his servant Skirnir on an errand to the realm of the giants to court the giantess Gerther on his behalf. Gerther was reluctant. Skirnir's persuasion involved, at various points, offers of gifts and eventually darker incentives, and in the end she agreed to meet Freyr. As payment for the errand, Freyr had given Skirnir his own sword, the magical self-wielding sword that fought by itself against the assembly of giants, the blade that, in the hands of its proper owner on the plain of Vigrathr, would have been sufficient to kill Surtur. Snorri notes this directly, without elaboration. If Freyr had kept his sword, he could have killed Surtur. Instead, he had traded it for the beginning of a love story, and now he faced the fire giant of Muspelheim with an antler in his hand. The image is precise and quietly extraordinary, the god who represented abundance, and the growing season, who embodied the warmth that made the world habitable and the fields productive, standing in the fire-lit chaos of the last battle, holding the improvised weapon of a creature of the forest, having given the one thing that could have changed the outcome away for the woman he loved. Freyr was overwhelmed and fell. Surtur's fire blazed on. Surtur, the one-handed god of law and just combat, met Garmr on the plain. Garmr was the great hound who had guarded the entrance to Hel throughout the mythological age, the dog bound at Gnipahellir, whose howling was listed among the signs of Ragnarok's approach. Tyr had already demonstrated his relationship to sacrifice at a significant cost. It was Tyr who had placed his hand in Fenrir's mouth as a pledge of good faith when the gods first bound the wolf with Gleipnir, and who had lost it when the gods refused to release the wolf as promised. The one-handed god of law, the figure the tradition associated with oaths and the right ordering of conflict, met the hound of hell on Vigrithr, and the tradition holds that each killed the other, Tyr falling to Garmar's bite, Garmar falling to Tyr's weapon, the two found dead in the same place when the fighting was over. Another paired completion, another long-standing antagonism resolved on the field, with the same economy that characterizes the Norse tradition's account of the entire battle. Heimdall and Loki, the watchman who saw everything, and the figure who had moved beneath observation for the entire age of the gods, the sharpest eyes in all the realms, and the one who had spent decades evading them, met on the plain and killed each other. The tradition does not preserve extended detail of their combat. What it preserves is the structural symmetry. Loki, who had been bound in the cave beneath the earth, with serpent venom dripping on his face until the earthquake of his agony shook the world above him, emerged for the final battle as an adversary not of the whole Norse cosmos in the abstract, but specifically of Heimdall, the god at the gate, the one whose horn had formally opened the engagement. Their deaths are recorded together in the same breath that the sources give them, two figures whose opposition ran through the mythological age in ways both obvious and subtle, finding each other in the last minutes of Vigrid and ending in the same moment. All of this, the swallowing of Odin, the 9 steps of Thor, the loss of Freyr, the paired deaths of Tyr and Garmar, and Heimdall and Loki, happened in the time it took Surtur to complete his crossing of the plain. The fire of Muspelheim was not a battlefield weapon in the ordinary sense. It was something more categorical, the heat and light that had existed at the world's southern edge since before the world took the shape it had inhabited through the entire mythological age, now freed from every boundary that had contained it. Surtur cast his fire, and the Völuspá describes what followed in one of the most celebrated passages of the poem, a passage that scholars of Old Norse literature have returned to for centuries because of the way it moves from the scale of combat to the scale of worlds in a single motion. The sun turns black, the earth sinks into the sea, the bright stars vanish from the sky, steam rises in the conflagration, and a high flame plays against heaven itself. Each clause is its own image. Each image is complete. The sun turning black is not the consequence of something else. It simply turns. The earth sinking into the sea does not follow from the fire reaching it. It sinks. The stars do not go out in sequence. They vanish. The Völuspá uses this staccato of completed facts to describe the end of the world, and the effect is less like watching a catastrophe than like watching a list of things cross themselves off, one by one, each in its proper turn, each in its proper time. The stars that vanished were the same stars that had been placed in the sky in the world's first making, when the gods took the sparks and embers from Muspelheim and set them in the dome of the sky to give the world its light and its navigational guides. Their placement had been one of the first deliberate acts of the gods in shaping the cosmos from the body of Ymir. Their extinction at Ragnarok completed the arc of what fire in the Norse imagination had always represented, the force that illuminated and the force that consumed, the warmth that made life possible and the heat that ended it, both always present in the tradition's understanding of Serpent's realm, and both present now simultaneously in the final moments of the plain of Vigrid. The ocean that had encircled Midgard since the gods used Ymir's blood to make the seas began to rise as the earth shifted. Jormungandr, dead in the grass of Vigrid, had circled that ocean with its body through the entire world's duration, the serpent that lay at the boundary between the human world and the outer chaos, the creature whose encircling tail had been one of the structural features of the world's physical shape. With Jormungandr dead and the boundary it embodied dissolved, the sea followed its own nature. The earth, not suddenly, but with the unhurried weight of something very large completing a motion it had already begun, began to submerge. The charred fields and the flooded plains and the scarred ground of Vigri went down beneath the rising water without violence. The ocean covered them the way water covers anything, slowly and completely and without discrimination. The Völuspá does not describe this ending in the register of catastrophe. There is no lamentation in the poem's account of the world's submersion. The poem has the quality throughout its Ragnarok passages of a witness observing events that have been prophesied too long and in too much detail to surprise anyone who knows them, a precise, economical narration of things completing themselves according to a pattern that was always going to complete itself. The tradition holds that the Volva, who delivered the original prophecy, was telling Odin things he had spent his entire existence trying to know, and what the poem renders is not horror, but the particular quality of attention one brings to watching something one has long anticipated finally arrive. There is care in the way the Völuspá moves through Ragnarok. There is the care of an observer who understands what they are seeing and considers it worth the care of exact language. The Prose Edda, Snorri's great 13th century prose rendering of the mythological tradition, handles the same material in the third-person voice of a narrator guiding the Icelandic king Gylfi through the cosmology of the Norse world. Gylfi, in the frame narrative that opens Gylfaginning, has disguised himself and entered the hall of the gods to extract the knowledge it contains, and the three figures who instruct him, high, just as high, and third, tell him everything they know, including everything about Ragnarok, with the same equanimity that characterizes the Völuspá's own telling. The tradition seems to have understood Ragnarok as something that could be contemplated, narrated, and examined in detail without the examination itself being an act of despair. Snorri was a Christian scholar writing in the 13th century about a pre-Christian tradition he considered historically significant rather than theologically true, and there is something in the way he renders Ragnarok precise, attentive, structured, that suggests the tradition itself had already developed a way of sitting with its own ending that did not require the ending to be undone in order to be bearable. Odin had known the whole weight of his knowledge-seeking. The eye surrendered at Mimir's well. The 9 nights on Yggdrasil, the summonings of dead Cirruses, the ravens Hugin and Munin flying out each morning to gather the news of the world and returning to whisper it in his ears, all of it had been in service of understanding a fate he could not change, and he had changed nothing. The tradition preserves this not as tragedy, but as something more unusual, the portrait of a figure who sought knowledge of his own unavoidable end, as fully and methodically as any figure in any mythology has ever sought anything, and who met that end in possession of exactly what he had sought. He knew the name of the wolf. He knew the number of Valhalla's doors. He knew the 9 steps Thor would take. He rode toward all of it on an 8-legged horse in the gray morning of the world's last day, with Gungnir leveled, and whatever can be said about the outcome, the seeking itself had been genuine and complete. The steam that the Völuspá describes rising in the conflagration catches the light of Surtur's fire in the way that steam catches any light. Diffusely, diffused, the bright and terrible fire translated into something softer and more vaporous as it touches the rising water. The image sits in the poem between the fire reaching heaven and the earth's final submersion, a transitional image of fire and water meeting and becoming neither one, the violence of the ending softened for a moment into something that looks, at the right distance and in the right light, almost like the steam that rises from any warm surface on a cold morning. The tradition does not call attention to this. The Voluspa simply places the image there and moves on. But it is there, in the sequence between the high flame and the sinking earth, steam rising, the temperature of an ending settling toward the temperature of what comes after. The plain of Vigrid, 100 leagues in every direction, went beneath the water with the rest of the world. The great ships went beneath it. Naglfar, built over all the ages of the world from the fingernails of the dead. The largest ship the tradition knew, now submerged in the same ocean that had provided Jormungandr with its domain. The fallen gods went beneath it. The fallen giants went beneath it. Surtur's fire, which had blazed higher than the sky in the moments of its release, met the rising water, and the two elements completed each other in the way the tradition had always understood them, fire and water as the primal forces from which Odin and his brothers had shaped the world in its first making. The creative tension between Muspelheim's heat and Niflheim's cold that had generated the first life in Ginnungagap, present again in the last moments in the form of the fire that ended everything and the water that swallowed what the fire left. The silence after is difficult to describe because the tradition does not ask its readers to imagine it as silence in the ordinary sense. What the Norse sources offer at the close of Ragnarok is the image of a world that has returned to something like the state it was in before the gods made it. Water, darkness, and the absence of the particular structures that had organized the world into its familiar shape. Asgard had stood. It no longer stood. Midgard had been encircled. It was encircled no longer. The 9 realms that Yggdrasil had connected and sustained, the great ash tree that had trembled at the beginning of the battle, and whose groaning had been one of the last sounds of the world in its old form, were submerged or burned or empty, each in the way the tradition had always said it would be. And the world tree itself, whose roots reached into Hervergomir and Mimir's well, and the realm of the dead, whose canopy had sheltered the eagle and the hawk that sat in its highest branches. The tradition does not describe its specific end in the battle. What it describes instead is the water rising, the world going under, the steam and the darkness, and the slow, deep, total quiet of an ocean covering a world that has completed its particular span. This is how the Norse tradition holds the ending. It had always known was coming, not with the urgency of something unexpected, but with the quality of attention that one brings to a thing that has been described and anticipated and prepared for over a very long time. Ragnarok was not a surprise. The gods knew. The seeresses knew. The tradition itself had structured its entire mythological age as a long and measured preparation for this specific morning. The Einherjar had been gathered one by one. The signs had assembled themselves across the realms over long, slow centuries. The horn had been kept beside Heimdall, and Heimdall had watched, and the watch had finally ended in the only way that the tradition said it could. The world had been known and named, and the knowing had not been enough to change it, and the tradition does not seem to have wanted it to. What the tradition wanted was the full accounting, the exact number of doors in Valhalla's walls, the 9 steps of a dying god, the detail of a sword exchanged for love, and its consequence years later on a burning plain, wanted every piece of the pattern held with the same attention, so that the ending, when it came, would feel complete rather than merely final. The earth settled beneath the water slowly, the way a very large and very old thing settles into stillness when it has finished moving. The last light of Surtur's fire faded across the surface of the sea. The steam dissipated. The darkness that remained was not the darkness of a world that had been destroyed and was gone, but the darkness of a world that had gone down, deeply and fully, into the cold and primordial water that lay beneath all things. The same water, or something like the same water, that had been there before Odin and Vili and Ve shaped the body of Ymir into the hills and seas and sky of the world the gods had known. The world was under the water. The water was still. The tradition holds this image at the end of Ragnarok's telling, the charred and submerged and silent surface of a sea, gone flat and dark and cold, and holds it with a patience that feels less like grief and more like the particular quality of waiting that the Norse mythological imagination brought to every great threshold. Something was under the water. The water was over the world, and in the still and lightless dark beneath the surface of that ancient sea. The world that the Norse tradition had described across centuries of telling lay quiet and cold and complete. The earth rises out of the sea, not violently, not with the sound of upheaval, but slowly, the way something returns that always knew it would. The water runs off its hills in long, bright streams, carrying nothing downstream but the clean cold of the deep, and by the time the first slope clears the surface entirely, the green is already there. Not a pale green of new growth searching for light, but a full, unhurried green, the color of something that did not have to be planted because it belongs to the soil itself. The unsown fields lie open and level above the retreating water line, and their grain is already bending, very gently, in a wind that has only just begun to move across a world where everything is still finding its position in the new silence. The Voluspa, the great prophetic poem of the Norse tradition, pivots from destruction to renewal with a line of such plainness that it has the quality of something observed rather than imagined. She sees the earth rising a second time out of the water, evergreen. No ceremony, no hesitation. The world simply returns, because the tradition holds that returning is what worlds do. The waterfalls are first. Before the plains have fully cleared, the high ground emerges above the receding sea, and from the new cliffs, the water that is gathered on the high slopes finds the edges and drops, white and loud, into the shallowing water below. The sound of them carries far in the new silence, a clean working sound, entirely without weight, the sound of water doing what water has always done, without memory of the fire that came before. The streams find the valley floors and begin to move toward the coast, and where they go, the ground darkens, and where the ground darkens, the green deepens, and within the space of a morning that in the new world has no measurement attached to it, the plains are covered. Grass, grain, the low, wide leaves of plants, the Norse tradition does not name specifically, because naming them would be to make them particular, and the tradition wants the listener to understand that everything is present. Every kind of growing thing, all of it unsown, all of it requiring nothing, all of it simply here because the renewed earth calls it here, and it comes. There is a detail in the Voluspa, and in Snorri Sturluson's later prose account, in Gylfaginning, the account of the beguiling of Gylfi, in which the cosmological knowledge of the Norse tradition is organized into sequential form, a detail that carries its meaning so quietly that it is easy to read past it. On the plain of Idavil, where Asgard once stood before the fire, the small group of gods who have survived gather for the first time in the renewed world. Vidhar is there, the silent god, the son of Odin, whose role in the ending was a single precise act performed when the moment required it. Vali is there, also a son of Odin, born for a single purpose in the old world, and now present in the new one, without that purpose attached to him any longer. Magni is there, the son of Thor, whose name means strength, carrying forward from the old world the name of the thing his father embodied. Mothi is there, alongside him, whose name means courage. Four gods in a field that was once the center of all things, the place where the great hall stood, and the gods gathered in the old age of the world, and the field now is grass and open sky, and the new light of the sun. The sun, the tradition describes simply as a new sun, present in the renewed world, because the world has need of it, and the world provides for its own needs. And then Snorri describes what they find. In the grass of Itavelwar, lying where they fell, or were set down, or were simply left in the confusion that preceded the fire, the gods find the golden gaming pieces of the earlier Aesir. Small, smooth, dense with the particular weight of gold, the color of them visible from a little distance in the new morning, lying in the grass the way objects lie when they have been dropped and no one came back for them. The gods crouch in the field and pick them up. That is the entirety of the image. There is no ceremony, no announced significance, no comment in the text on what it means to find the old world preserved in this form, these small, portable, beautiful things that survived everything, lying in the open field where the hall used to stand, waiting to be found by the people who came after. The gaming pieces of the old Aesir in the hands of the gods of the New Age, held up to the light to see the familiar pattern of the gold. Whatever was lost, and everything was lost, the tradition preserves this image of continuity, not as an argument, but as an observation. Things survive, small things especially. The new world picks up the beautiful objects the old world left behind, and holds them, and continues. The gathered gods speak together on the plain of Ithavel, and the Velispa records what they speak about. They remember the older time. They speak of the past, of the things they knew in the ages before, of the great events and the figures and the patterns of the world as it was. The tradition holds that remembering is something the new age begins with, not mourning, not reconstruction, but simply the act of knowing what came before and holding it. Snorri's account in Gylfaginning treats this gathering with a particular quiet attention, as though the image of gods sitting in an open field in the new morning, speaking about the past together, is the thing most worth preserving from the entire account of the world's renewal. The hall will be built again. The new age will grow into itself, but the tradition pauses here, in the field, before any of that begins, and allows the gods simply to be together in the open light, with the golden pieces warm in their hands and the memory of everything intact. Baldriff returns from hell. The tradition introduces this without preface, in the plain declarative manner the Velispa uses for things it considers self-evident. The god who was the most radiant of all the Aesir, the one the tradition describes as shining, as the one whose presence made the world better by his being in it, was killed in the old age, before the ending, by a blind god holding a sprig of mistletoe, guided by a hand that knew what it was doing. His death was the crack in the world's order, the thing that could not be undone, the grief that proved no grief was impossible for gods any more than for anyone else. And hell held him, because the rule of hell was that what came there did not leave. The tradition is consistent about this in the old world. The old world's rules were strict, and Baldur remained in hell's hall, and the world above continued without him, diminished by his absence in ways the stories make felt without stating. In the renewed world, those rules have changed, not been broken, changed. Hel held Balder for the length of the old world's life, and the old world is over, and Balder walks back into the light. He returns to Ithavel, to the plain where the other gods have gathered, and the Völuspá describes his arrival with the same quiet restraint it uses for the earth rising from the sea. He is simply present. The tradition does not describe the moment of return in dramatic terms, because the tradition does not require drama to make the image felt. The god of light, the radiant one, standing in the morning of the new world on the plain where the hall of the gods once stood, is its own sufficient statement. The other gods are there, the golden gaming pieces are there, the open sky of the renewed world is there, and Balder is there. The absence that defined so much of the old age simply ends the way absences end, without announcement. Hörð comes with him. Hörð, the blind god, who was guided into the act that killed Bald, who did not choose it in the ordinary sense, and yet whose hand held the mistletoe, and whose throw carried the consequence. Hörð walks out of hell beside his brother. The tradition offers no account of what was said between them, if anything was said. The two are reconciled on the plain of Ithavel in Snorri's telling, and the violence and the grief that shaped the final chapters of the old world are not carried forward into the new. The new age does not import its predecessors' unfinished arguments. Whatever needed to be resolved was resolved in the duration of hell. Whatever that duration was, measured by rules the tradition does not describe, and the two gods arrive in the renewed world together. Both of them present, neither of them defined any longer by the event that sent one of them to the dark. This is the pattern the tradition offers for the new age, that the old terms do not apply, that the new world begins not with repair of the old, but with the genuinely new, as open and unhurried as the unsown grain bending in the wind above the rising ground. Honir is present in the renewed world as well. The tradition mentions him briefly. The god associated with prophecy and with decision, present at the beginning of the Norse cosmological account, and present again here at its renewal, as though the tradition is acknowledging that the capacity to divine, to know forward, belongs to the new age as naturally as it did to the old. He will choose the lot twigs, the Völuspá says, meaning he will practice the old art of prophecy in the new world, will read the signs that the world provides to those who know how to ask it questions. The tradition places the ancient arts of knowing inside the new age without difficulty, as though the new world would not be fully the world unless someone were reading its patterns and attending to what they say. There is a hall described in the Norse sources whose name is Gimle, and the Völuspá describes it standing south of heaven, its roof thatched with gold, brighter in appearance than the sun, outlasting even the fire of the ending. Snorri's account in Gelfaginning repeats and elaborates this. Gimle is the place the tradition designates for the righteous after the destruction, the hall that survives because it stands somewhere that Surtur's fire does not reach, at a remove from the world that placed it beyond the category of things that can be burned. The description of it in the sources is notably simple. No vast hall of 1,000 rooms, no catalogue of its treasures, no enumeration of who exactly qualifies for its halls or what the terms of residence are. Just this, a hall on a height, the gold of its roof catching the light of the new sun, the air around it still and clear, the building itself quiet and plain and enduring, standing there as it has apparently always stood, through the fire and the flooding and the darkness available. There is something in the simplicity of that image worth staying with. The Norse tradition had access to more elaborate visions of paradise than this. The traditions neighboring it, and the traditions that preceded it, were full of afterlife architectures of considerable splendor, multi-tiered and carefully organized. The Gimle that the Völuspá describes is singular. One hall, gold roof, very bright, south of heaven, which is a direction that implies orientation, implies a sky, implies a world around it that gives it position. The enduring dwelling is not a kingdom or a city. It is a hall, the fundamental Norse social space, the place where people gather indoors against the cold and the dark, where the fire is shared, where the community exists in its most basic physical form. What the tradition imagines as the destination of the righteous after the end of everything is in its essential form the same as what any community in any Norse winter would have found most necessary: a warm hall, light enough to see by, with enough room inside for everyone who has come in from the cold. Two people emerge from the forest. In the sheltered grove called Hodmimus Holt, hidden from the fire of the ending, the way small things are sometimes hidden by the largeness of the spaces around them, two humans have survived. The tradition names them Lifif, which carries the meaning of life in the oldest sense, and Lifthrassir, whose name the tradition gives as something close to life yearning, or one who strives for life, the desire to continue, embodied and given a name to travel with. They sheltered in Hodmimus Holt while the fire moved across the world. The tradition does not elaborate on how they knew to go there, or how long they waited, or what the grove looked like from the inside while the sky above it was the color of everything ending. The tradition offers only this: they were there, they were fed on the morning dew while the fire passed over, and they emerged. The morning dew. That particular detail has a quality common to the details the Norse tradition preserves most carefully. It is so specific and so small that the imagination holds it. Not food stored in the grove before the ending, not a miraculous provision conjured for the occasion. Morning dew, the ordinary condensation that forms on grass and leaves in the cold hours before sunrise, drawn from the moisture in the air, present every morning without exception, available to anyone who knows to look for it and is patient enough to gather it. The tradition feeds its survivors of the world's ending on the most quiet and most common of water sources, and this seems deliberate. The two humans most necessary to the continuation of everything, the two people on whom the entire next age depends, are sustained not by miracle, but by the reliable small generosity of the world providing, in its most minimal form, exactly what is needed to survive. The morning dew, every morning, through all of it. They emerge from Hodmimus Holt into the morning of the renewed world. The trees of the grove are behind them, old trees, the tradition implies, trees that stood through the ending as the grove stood, their roots holding the ground steady in a way the roots of very old trees do, their branches moving now in the new wind with the particular unhurried movement of things that are not surprised by wind. Ahead of them is open ground, the new grass, the unsown grain, the streams running down from the high slopes toward the distant new sea. There is enough space in the image that the smallness of two people standing at its edge is part of what the image is about. The entire renewed world, emptied by the fire and the flooding, refilled now with green and water and light, lying open in front of them, two figures at the border of the old forest where they sheltered and the new world they are about to enter, neither of them hurrying, both of them simply standing there with the dew still on the grass around their feet. The tradition holds that they become the ancestors of all future humanity in the renewed age. Every person who will ever live in the world, the Norse tradition imagines as coming after every new community, every family, every generation stretching forward from that first morning begins here, with Life and Leifthraseer at the edge of Hodmimus Holt, looking out. This is the tradition's understanding of origin as it applies to the second human age, and it has the quality that the Norse tradition frequently returns to. The vast stated simply, without ceremony, in terms so plain that the vastness registers only after a moment. They will be the ancestors of all the peoples of the world, all of them. From this single morning, from these two figures standing in the new light, with the old forest behind them, the tradition does not describe them carrying anything out of the grove. No objects, no fire, no provisions. They carry the morning dew they were nourished on, and the memory of the trees above them, and whatever they know about being alive in a world that requires it of them, and they step out of the trees into the open ground. The new sun is moving across the new sky. The Voluspa mentions the daughter of the sun in the renewed world. The sun that was swallowed at the ending had a daughter, and now the daughter rides the sky in the mother's place, following the same arc, carrying the same warmth and the light falling on the new earth, with the same quality of light that has always made the Norse world alternately generous and withdrawn depending on the season. The tradition's continuity is expressed partly in this image, not a different sun, not a reimagined relationship between the world and its star, but the same arc, the same warmth, the same movement across the sky that the Norse tradition had always organized its year around. The daughter of the old sun makes the same journey her mother made, and the new world is illuminated by it, and the grain bends in the new wind under the new light, and the streams catch it and carry it down to the sea. There is something particular about the word the Voluspa uses for the reborn earth, evergreen, not simply green in the renewed morning, not provisionally green until the new seasons establish themselves, but evergreen, meaning always, meaning continuously, meaning the quality of greenness is not contingent on the season or the weather or the mercy of whatever powers arrange such things. The word carries the implication of a world that has moved past the anxiety about scarcity that the old world never quite escaped, the worry about the harvests, the watching of the sky for the clouds that would bring rain or fail to bring it, the calculation of whether the stores would last until the thaw. In the Old Norse world, these were not abstract worries, they were the material of survival, and the renewed world, in the tradition's telling, removes them, not by providing abundance in a conspicuous way, not by filling warehouses or guaranteeing harvests, but simply by changing the nature of the ground. The earth itself is evergreen. It does not require persuasion. The gods who gather on Ithavel the golden pieces warm in their hands, Bald present among them, Höd reconciled, the morning of the new world open around them. These are not gods preparing for a repetition of the old age. The tradition does not suggest that Asgard will be rebuilt, and the old patterns resumed, and the whole long cycle will simply begin again. What Gulfagening and the Voluspa describe is something quieter than that. Gods in a field, talking, finding familiar objects in the new grass, the sun moving across an unclouded sky, the world around them full and green, and asking very little of them at the moment. The urgency of the old age, the watching, the preparing, the gathering of warriors, the knowledge of the ending and the need to face it, is over, not forgotten. The tradition is clear that the gods remember, but the pressure of knowing what is coming has been released, because what was coming has come, and the world after it is simply this, an open field, a morning, the golden pieces of the old game, and the particular quiet of a world that is not about to end. The great ash tree persists. Yggdrasil, the immense tree connecting the worlds, its roots reaching into the three wells beneath it. Its canopy, stretching above the 9 worlds, is present in the accounts of renewal in a way that suggests it survived. The tradition does not dwell on this, does not offer an explanation of how it survived the fire that scoured the worlds, does not itemize which of its branches remained and which were scorched. It simply persists. The oldest and most fundamental structure of the Norse cosmological imagination, the tree that was there at the beginning and present at the ending, is there in the New Age as it was in the Old, not defined now by the trembling that announced the end of the old order, but rooted, its roots still in the deep wells, its branches still reaching above whatever the worlds have become in the New Age. The tree does not require explanation. It was always there, and it is still there, and the worlds it connects are new, and the tree is the same tree. In the deep places of the New World, the Norse tradition imagines the waters that were always the foundation of things continuing to move and to hold. Urthaturin, the well of Urthur, whose name the tradition connects to the concept of fate, as something that has already become, the layer of time that is immovably past, remains in the accounts of renewal as it remained through everything. The Norns who tended it are not described departing. The well does not dry up or cease to be the thing it was. In a tradition where the past is understood as the dimension of fate, most fully realized, where what has happened is regarded as having a particular metaphysical weight that the present and the future do not share, the persistence of the well of what has already been is its own kind of statement about the new world. The New Age is not simply beginning on cleared ground. It is beginning on ground that has a past now, on ground whose roots reach down into the record of everything that happened before, and that record is intact and held and will not stop being the thing it is. The Völuspá is a poem about knowing. The seeress who speaks it knows everything she tells, knows it not from having lived through it, but from the specific Norse understanding of prophetic knowledge as a form of sight, a seeing into the pattern of things that allows the woven structure of time to be read from any position within it. She describes the creation of the worlds and the lives of the gods and the gathering of omens and the battle and the fire and the flooding and the renewal, and she describes all of it in the past tense as though reporting what she has seen. The new world, in her account, is as already complete as the old world is, already happened, already woven, already there in the pattern she is reading. The second earth rising evergreen out of the sea is not a hope in the Völuspá, it is an observation. She has seen it, it is there. There is a quality of calm in that which is worth attending to at this hour. The Norse tradition, in its most ancient surviving form, understood the renewal of the world not as a promise or a reward or a compensation for the suffering of the ending, but simply as part of the structure of things, the next event in the sequence that the seeress has been reading from the beginning. The ending was always going to happen. The renewal was always going to follow. The earth was always going to rise again, evergreen, out of the sea that received it, and the sun's daughter was always going to ride the ark her mother rode, and Balder was always going to walk back from hell into the light, and Leif Thrasir were always going to step out of the forest into the open ground of the new morning. The tradition holds these things not as consolations, but as facts, features of the world's structure, knowable in the way the seeress knows them, present in the pattern she reads as clearly as the roots of Yggdrasil are present in the wells beneath the world. The golden gaming pieces lie in the new grass on Idavil, and the gods are sitting together in the morning, and the sun is moving across the sky, and very far away, at the edge of Hodmimis Holt, two people are standing at the border between the old forest and the open world. The streams are running, The grain is bending in the wind. Gimle stands on its height to the south, with its golden roof catching the new light and the air around it perfectly clear and still. Balder is speaking. The tradition does not record what he says, only that he is present, only that his voice is part of what fills the renewed air of Idhavel Rull on this first morning. Whatever he says, it is not urgent. The quality of the New Age is not urgency. It is the particular openness of something that has come through everything and found itself on the other side of it, standing in a field, holding small golden things in its hands, in no hurry at all. The tradition that preserved this image carried it through the long oral centuries of the Viking Age, pressed it into manuscript in Iceland in the 13th century, held it in the Codex Regius through 400 years of careful storage before it made its way to the scholars who could read it. This tradition was not primarily interested in catastrophe. The catastrophe is present. The fire and the flooding and the deaths of the gods are given their full weight, described with the specific precision that the Norse tradition brings to things it considers important. But the tradition preserved the renewal with equal care, gave it equal space, recorded the evergreen earth and the golden gaming pieces, and Baldur's return, and the emergence of Leif and Leifthrossir, with the same deliberate attention it brought to the crowing of the roosters and the trembling of the world tree. The ending and the renewal are not in competition in the Norse account. They are the same story told in its proper order. The seeress who speaks the Völuspá delivers her account, and then she falls silent. The poem ends with her descent, her return to wherever the dead return to after they have spoken, and the words she delivered are left behind her in the air of whatever space the imagination assigns to the encounter, still present, still moving. The way of voice continues for a moment after the person speaking has left the room. Odin, who summoned her and listened to everything she told, carries the knowledge of it forward. The world the tradition describes continues in all the ways it always continued, the deep patterns of it unchanged by the act of their being spoken aloud. The seers knew this. The knowledge is one of the oldest kinds, that saying a thing does not alter the thing, that the pattern was always there, and the speaking of it is simply the speaking of it, one more act in a long sequence of acts that were woven before the speaking and will continue after it. And so the worlds rest.